All right, if you weren't here last week, we started a new series and we have one handout so far. It's a timeline of church history. So if you didn't get that last week, they're up here. We're not really going to use it as much tonight. So if you don't have one, you can wait till the end and grab one or whatever. And it's also online, different places. So we started this series last week, Doctrinal Drift, how theology changed over time. And last week we did this kind of big sweep of church history, at least up to the Reformation area, which was in the 1500s. Now, tonight we're going to cover our first topic. So this series, what we're going to do is we're going to take certain doctrines or beliefs that are popular today, and we're going to trace them back through church history to find out what did the earliest Christians believe, and then as we move forward in history, how did it change over time? Because to be honest, there's certain things that we believe here in American Christianity that is a little different back in history, or sometimes we believe things in American Christianity that doesn't even exist in ancient history. You can't find anybody talking about that belief. So what we're doing each week is we're taking one of those things and we're just kind of tracking it down. Now, before we dig into this tonight, I've got a few things I've got to tell you. The notes, if you have our app, all the notes are in the app. There is 3,600 words in the app for tonight. Obviously, I cannot cover all that stuff. What I've been doing is working on this for a while now, and there's a lot of stuff in there. There's a lot of stuff from ancient Christian writers, and I've given you all the quotes. I'm not going to read all that to you tonight, so don't worry. We've got plenty to cover as it is. So I'm going to move really fast, and you'll have time for questions at the end. Don't forget. All right, so we got a lot to cover. I'm going to move really fast. I'm not going to read everything in the notes to you. This is going to be like a fire hydrant thing, okay? We could spend a whole series just on this one topic, and that topic is creationism. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. Now, understand, all Jews and Christians in ancient history, everybody was a creationist, okay? So that's not the issue on the table tonight. It's about what kind of creationist are you? So there's a difference between creationist and creationism. Now, usually when you stick an ism on it, you've got a system of theology that somebody come up with at some point in history. So I'm differentiating these two things. Okay, if you're a Christian and you say you believe the Bible, you are a creationist. If you believe the Bible, because it says on page 1, God created everything, right? So creationists believe that God created the universe and everything that's in it. Creationism is a different thing. And here's how I'm using that term. Okay, now if you Google creationism, it may give you something else. I'm just trying to tell you here's what I mean by this term. Okay, creationism is a kind of obsession with proving that the Bible is scientifically correct and modern science is all wrong. And anybody who's not young earth creation, they're old earth creation, they're wrong too and they don't really believe the Bible. That's what creationism is about. It's kind of this obsession with trying to prove something about the creation story. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, somewhat. Y'all are looking at me weird. Is the TV still doing the thing? Is that what it is? So here's 3 categories of creationists, okay? There's number 1, just creationists. We believe God created the universe. Simple enough, right? Then there's young earth creationists. And the modern definition of that is that God created the universe about 6,000 years ago, okay? Not just the earth, the whole universe, 6,000 years ago. Old earth creationists is the 3rd category. God created the universe, could be millions of years old. Okay, and they don't try to put dates on that. At least a lot of them don't. So that's your 3 categories. Now, everybody in here should be number 1. The question is, what we're going to talk about tonight, is what about 2 and 3? You know, which one should we do? Now, before we get into this, I need you to understand where you fall in these 3 categories makes no difference to your salvation. Okay? You can be an old earth creationist and still be a Christian. You can be young earth and still be a Christian, and obviously creationists are Christians, right? Now, if you said, I don't believe God created anything, then you're outside of the faith now. You're going against what Scripture clearly states. Okay, we can argue about how long ago, but you can't argue about whether God did it or not, right? Okay, so we good? All right, so let's nobody get bent out of shape tonight. All right, and remember in this series, I'm not trying to tell you what to think. I'm trying to teach you how to think. Okay, I'm trying to teach you. I'm trying to show you the data, the information, and then you can decide. Okay, because this is not a salvation issue. I don't need to tell you what to believe about this. I'm just trying to give you the information. Okay, so everybody good? Nobody got rocks in their pockets they're going to throw at me later, right? Okay, good. I have a gun, so it'll be fine. Actually, I don't. It's in the truck. Um, okay, here's a disclaimer right out the gate. I believe that God created the heavens, the earth, and all of its inhabitants, and he did so whenever and however he chose. Good? Now, since God can do anything he wants, God could have created in 6 literal days, 6 longer periods of time, 6 seconds, or 1 nanosecond. He could have done either one of those if he wanted to, right? He's all powerful. He could do it any way he wants. Okay? When is not the point of Genesis 1. We're going to dig into it later. Who and why is the focus of the creation story. Who did it and why did he do it? That's the main point. Okay? And I'll show you that when we're going to actually dig into the text. We're going to do some history first, then we're going to dig into some things you need to notice about Genesis 1 toward the end. Okay, let's start with a popular myth. And you might think that's not a myth, but it is. The Bible clearly states, and the church has always taught, that God created the world in 6 literal 24-hour days around 6,000 years ago. You hear this said all the time in theological circles that this is what's true. The Bible clearly says this. The church always taught this. And the reason why I call that a myth is because it is a myth. The church has not always taught everything you see right there, and the Bible does not clearly state that. Okay? So we're going to learn that in a minute. Y'all look so nervous, and I'm nervous too. All right? All right, let's start with the early Christians. Remember, the early Christians are usually, I would say, between the apostles and about 325 AD. That's the Ante-Nicene Fathers. That's on your timeline. But we're going to go from 70 AD all the way to 500 for a little bit. The writings of the early Christians show a diversity of views on creation. Now, to be clear, they all believe God did it. They weren't debating about that at all, okay? But there was diversity of how to interpret Genesis chapter 1. Some mention the 6 days briefly without any explanation. So just in passing, they say, we know that God created the earth in 6 days, and they move right on to something else. They don't explain, they don't say what they mean by that or what their view is, because really people weren't arguing about this early on. Others are more detailed, but do not read the 6 days as literal 24-hour days. And there's a bunch of quotes in your notes that show that. However, the early Christians were not divided over this issue. Now today, we're severely divided over this issue. I was checking my own work, and I listened to some of the young earth creationists debating old earth creationists today on YouTube while I was working on something else. And I saw this happen. I saw people calling names and mistreating and misrepresenting each other. And the early Christians weren't doing that. Not on this issue. Now, they were on other issues, because like one guy said, well, I think Jesus was created. He's not eternal. He's actually a created being. They argued about that, because that's heresy, right? But they didn't argue about this. So they weren't divided over this issue, and it wasn't a focus of their writings. The Nicene Creed in 325, we talked about that a little bit last week, it only states that God is the maker of all things visible and invisible. It says nothing about how to interpret the days. There's no argument about that stuff. It's just, here's the things we believe. That's what a creed is. This is the ancient creed. And it just states he's the maker of all things visible and invisible. Okay? So in the early church, this wasn't a big deal like it is nowadays. And there are many reasons for that we'll get into. So I'll start with this quote, and then from here on out, I don't have a lot of quotes on the screen. So this is Theophilus of Antioch, and he wrote this around 180 AD. Okay, so he's the generation after the apostles, or 2 generations. He says, of this 6 days' work, talking about the 6 days in Genesis 1, no man can give a worthy explanation and description of all its parts. not though he had 10,000 tongues and 10,000 mouths, nay, though he were to live 10,000 years. What is Theophilus saying? He's saying you can come up with whatever view you want to about the 6 days. You still don't fully understand all that God did. Right? We can all agree on that. Okay? This is wisdom. Okay? And you read a lot of this in the early church writings. They're saying, look, and by the way, Theophilus has a view about the creation days, but he also said this in the same book. Okay? He gives his view later on, and it's in your notes, but I just wanted to point this out, that this was kind of the consensus in the early church, that we can have a different understanding about this, but the bottom line is we don't really know what all he did. We don't really know exactly how he did all this, right? Okay, so I said I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I want you to believe at least that, okay? Can we just agree that we weren't there, we didn't watch it happen, therefore we can't be 100% sure exactly what view to take? Make sense? Okay, good. All right, so let me give you some of the views that we see in the early church writings after the apostles. The day-age view, in my research, seems to be one of the most popular things that you see written about the most, the day-age view. This is the idea that each day of creation could represent up to 1,000 years. And they get this from Psalm 90, verse 4, and 2 Peter 3:8. Peter quotes Psalm 90, and he says, "A day to the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day," right? Now, does he mean that completely literally, or is he just saying God's outside of time, he's not bound by time? That's really what he's saying, okay? But a lot of the early church writers read that, and they said, we know these days of creation, if this is God's work that he did, it was explained in this 6-day thing, but it could be 6,000 years, because a day is 1,000 years, 1,000 years a day, right? So you can kind of see where they would arrive at this view. But it was extremely popular, and a lot of the early writers understood it that way. But they weren't dogmatic about it. They didn't say this is what everybody has to believe. They were just writing saying, here's what Scripture says, and maybe that means this. That's kind of how they did it. They weren't fighting about it. So you can see that in the Epistle of Barnabas. There's argument about whether Barnabas really wrote that or not. It's an interesting book. I enjoy reading it. Justin Martyr's a great writer. Irenaeus, Theophilus that we quoted a minute ago. Cyprian and Lactantius. He was the first dairy farmer. You needed a joke. Good grief. That was a joke, by the way. Sorry, Lactantius. So these guys and many more, I'm just giving you a sample here. I'm just listing the people who I gave you quotes in your notes for. They're more than this, but I'm just trying to give you some background. The other view that we see in the early centuries of the church is the figurative day view. The creation days aren't literal days because time itself is not created until the 4th day in the creation story. We'll talk about this in detail in a little bit. So here's 3 of the popular guys that wrote about that, Clement, Origen, and Augustine. Like I said, there's more, but those are the ones who are popular. Augustine actually wrote a whole book on the interpretation of Genesis. So he gives you a lot about his view, and Origen did too. But so in their mind, these days are laid out in a figurative way. You shouldn't be taking each day as literal 24 hours because the passage itself, the time is created on day 4. So how could the first 3 days be literal time? So anyway, we'll talk about that in detail when we get to Genesis in a minute. So here's a summary. The early Christians, up to 500, did not have one view of the creation days or the age of the earth. Nearly all of them believed that the earth was already around 6,000 years old in the 1st and 2nd century. Okay, so the young earth creationists today say if you're going to believe the Bible, you have to believe that it's 6,000 years old today. But the earliest Christians, even if they thought about the age of the earth, they already thought it was 6,000 years old almost 2,000 years ago. Okay, so none of these guys we just talked about would qualify as young earth creationists by the modern definition. Am I making any sense right now? Okay. So, just want to tell you that. All right. So, Let's go to the Middle Ages. Fast forward a little bit. And by the way, remember, there's so much more to this. I'm just giving you a sample, all right? In the Middle Ages, we still see a diversity of views. There's not one view. There's not an official view of the Christian church that this is how you have to read Genesis 1. Okay, there were differing views. Some believe that the creation days were figurative, and some believe that it was literal. One example, John Calvin said the days of creation are figurative. He wrote a whole commentary on Genesis. Calvin's a popular guy. I'm not as big a fan of him as I used to be, but he said that he thought that Moses was not an astronomer. He knew nothing about astronomy. He's Moses, right? So he's not trying to do science, is basically Calvin's view. Then between the late 1500s and mid 1600s, Bishop Ussher, this guy did something that's truly amazing. I think he was wrong, but I think it was amazing work. He did this big history work and tried to put dates on a lot of stuff, and he got a lot of stuff right. But he came up with this, that the creation days began on the evening, he had it down to the hour almost, on the evening of October 22nd, 4004 BC. So that was the first day of creation, okay? Now, there's all kinds of ways that he arrived at that, but I'm telling you that to let you know that that's what almost all of the young earth creationists today, they go with that date. And usually they arrive at it by taking all the genealogies in the Old Testament, working backwards. And they usually don't think about the fact that all the genealogies in the Bible are not complete. There's things left out intentionally. The authors even tell you that. Anyway, I'm not telling you how to think. Sorry. Or what to believe. So he set a date on it. And in this time period, that date became fairly popular. Some famous scientists even went with that date. But for the most part, the church didn't like the idea that we're trying to set a date on the first day of creation. Because before that, 1,500 years before that, nobody was trying to do that. They weren't putting a date on it, and they weren't arguing about that, okay? So this was kind of a new thing, and it didn't really catch on all that much, and that's the Middle Ages. The other thing that got popular in the 1700s was this thing called the chaos restitution theory. It's also later developed in something called the gap theory. The chaos restitution theory says that God created the heavens and the earth in Genesis 1:1, that's verse 1, and the earth is without form and void in 1:2 for an unknown period of time. So God created the heavens and the earth, it's without form and void. There could be who knows how much time before verse 3 happens where God says, let there be light, and he starts the creation days, right? So that was the idea that the earth was chaotic for who knows how long in this without form and void state, and then he starts creating. So that was the view in the 1700s, but in the 1900s, a guy named C.I. Scofield, and I don't think he developed this, but he included it in the Scofield Reference Bible. Any of you have a Scofield Reference Bible? Okay, I had one growing up. I've got a few actually at home. Very, very popular Bible. Like this was the Bible for a long time. But it had some very strange views in the study notes, and the gap theory was one of those. But in Scofield's Bible, he added that in this gap between Genesis 1:2 and 1:3, that's when there was this whole other world going on, and Satan became the ruler of that world, and he fell and took a third of the angels, and that's when all that happened. And then Genesis 1:3 starts. And that was kind of new. That was a lot to stuff into a gap. But that was famously called the gap theory for a long time. So just giving you a sample of what different people thought. All right, so that's the history of that. Now let's talk about young earth creationism, or I'll abbreviate it YEC on the screen from here on out. What is it? According to the website of Answers in Genesis. Now, if you don't know who that is, have you heard of the Ark Encounter? Where they built the big ark, life-size ark, okay, which, by the way, is really cool. But Answers in Genesis built that. That's the whole, they have a creation museum. They are kind of the most popular group right now of young earth creationists, okay? And this is their definition from their website. I did not make this up. Young earth creationists believe that the creation days of Genesis 1 were 6 literal 24-hour days, which occurred 6,000 years ago. Now, they go a step further, too. They believe the whole universe is 6,000 years old, not just the earth. Okay? So that's what it is. Now let's talk about the history of the modern view of young earth creationism. Okay? We still good? Everybody all right? Okay. This is the kind of the shocking part. Okay? And I admit it, but it's interesting. About 100 years ago, in this country, most Christians in America were old earth creationists, not young earth creationists. The young earth view gained traction over time beginning in the 1950s. Now, there were certain areas where people were becoming young earth creationists before that, but it became kind of the popular view beginning in the 1950s. The origin of young earth creationism is actually rooted in the heretical group, you might have heard of them, Seventh-day Adventists. Now, I know that sounds offensive, I'm calling it heretical, but the reason why I call them that is because they literally classify as a cult. Because what classifies you as a cult, a Christian cult, is you think you're the only people going to heaven and all the other Christians aren't. Okay, that makes you a Christian cult. You're an exclusivist. Okay, so they believe things. We have a Seventh-day Adventist church in town. Great people, but their views are interesting. One of them, their most popular view, is that if you worship on Sunday, you have accepted the mark of the beast found in Revelation, and you will burn for that. So you're lost because you worship on Sunday. That's why they're called Seventh-day Adventists. They worship on Saturday, on the Sabbath. Okay? Now, you good for some history? Okay, this is going to shock you. Seventh-day Adventists, they were started by James White and Ellen G. White, that's a married couple, and one other guy, I can't remember his name now, in the 1840s. They started this as a result of the failed predictions of the return of Jesus by the Millerites. The Millerites were a group that started out of the Second Great Awakening, big revival thing sweeping the nation. A lot of groups spun off of that. A lot of really bad theology spun out of that movement. But the Millerites was one group. William Miller, and he made this famous prediction that in between spring of 1843 and spring of 1844, Jesus would return. So he gave him a year, right? But he said during that year, at some point, he's going to return. Now, about summertime, 1844, the Millerites were like, "What the heck, dude? Jesus didn't show up. He's late." Which famously, Lazarus' story, he tends to be late, 4 days. Anyway, joke whenever you had. So they're kind of upset. So William Miller, he says, "Oh, you know what? I forgot about the Day of Atonement that happens in October. That's when he's going to show up. I was just a few months off. He's going to come back, Day of Atonement, 1844. And then that came and Jesus didn't show back up. So James and Ellen G. White, they split off. They get tired of this whole predicting thing, so they split off and they start what becomes the Seventh-day Adventist movement. Now, many of the beliefs of the Seventh-day Adventist are based on the prophetic visions of Ellen G. White. She is their prophetess. So a lot of their beliefs are based on visions she had, not necessarily on scripture, but on visions that she had. And one of those visions, she was taken back in time. This is what she claims, taken back in time to the creation event, okay? Genesis chapter 1. She was taken back in time to that. And she's told and shown that this creation event took place in not 6 periods of time, but 6 literal 24-hour days. But she was also taken into space and shown that there were all these other Earth-like planets that had life on them that existed way before Earth did. So God's got other planets and other people out there too. And the universe is old, but the earth is young. Okay? So that's what she was teaching. That was her prophetic vision. And if you're not familiar with prophetic type stuff, there are groups today that follow prophets. And the prophet can say some of the wackiest stuff and everybody just goes along with the prophet. Okay? That wasn't new then and it's definitely not new today. Because all the prophets said Trump was going to win re-election. I don't know if y'all noticed that, but all the prophets were wrong in 2020. They're all still prophets, and they all still raking in the money, but anyway, let's just set that aside. But this was this kind of deal. She prophesied all of these things and taught them. Okay, so she's teaching that it's 6 literal 24-hour days in creation. One of the members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, who's not a scientist, he just likes to study geology and stuff. He starts coming up with these papers and books that he writes on flood geology. Because one of the things is that the layers in the earth are not laid down by long periods of time. It was actually the flood of Noah that laid it all down instantly, and that's called flood geology. So George McReady, which I love that name, McReady. It's like McRib, but you're ready. Anyway, so George McReady Price, he started writing these books about flood geology. He literally is like the first guy that starts saying that the flood of Noah created all the rock layers on earth. Nobody was talking about that. That shocked me because I thought that like went back to, Jesus or something. But he was the one who made that popular in the 1920s. But it didn't take off for a long time. This other guy, Bernard, he wrote a refutation, the Christian's view of science and Scripture in 1954, and he was refuting Mr. McReady. And he was saying, this guy is wrong. Like, he's just doing Seventh-day Adventist prophet stuff. Like, this isn't real reality, what he's talking about. That led, I feel like the guy drawing lines on the board. That led John Whitcomb Jr. to write his doctoral dissertation against the Bernard guy. And he wanted to turn his dissertation into a book. The problem was he couldn't get any scientist, not Christian or unchristian, to co-author this book because they disagreed with his dissertation. They said, you're just rehashing the Price guy's idea from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He couldn't get anybody to co-author, but he finally got this guy named Henry Morris in 1961, who was a hydraulic engineer. He's not theologically trained. He's just a hydraulic engineer. Now, he did have a PhD in hydraulic engineering. But he convinced Morris to write a book with him in 1961, and that was called The Genesis Flood. And that ended up taking off in 1961. It started becoming more and more popular. It was so popular that they created a whole ministry out of it. It's called the Creation Research Institute, CRI, still going on today. Later groups spun out of that called Creation Ministries International and Answers in Genesis, which is the Ark people. Then they followed the same views and popularized young earth creationism in America, except they go further than the Adventists do. Because remember, the prophetic vision was that earth was young, but the universe is old. The young earth creationists of today say the whole universe is 6,000 years old. Now, some of them disagree and say, no, it might be like 8,000 or it might be 10,000, but most of them say 6,000 years old is when the universe was created, not just the earth. So that's how this view became popular. Before the 1950s, this was a fringe idea, which I did not know that until very recently. Now, here's some problems I see with the young earth creationist movement of today, all right? The main flaw in that movement is the idea that the Bible should be used as a divine science book. Now, does any of the biblical authors, did they know anything about science? No, definitely not anything about modern science. I mean, they looked at the stars and studied that, but they didn't have telescopes, right? So they don't know anything about science. But this creationism of today is trying to force science into ancient books of the Bible. And I think that's dangerous to do that. This not only leads to strange interpretations of the Bible, like Leviathan and the book of Job is like a dinosaur or something. Things like that come out of this thinking. But also it creates a barrier between science and the Bible. So what it does is it pits science and the Bible against one another when you're trying to force the Bible to be a science book. And that ends up being a bad idea. It sounds cool at first, but it ends up not being the best approach. And many in the young earth creationist movement believe their view is the only correct view, and if you believe anything else, you're compromising the Bible, you don't believe the Bible. I literally heard one of them say that today online. That if you don't believe that the earth is and the universe is 6,000 years old, if you think it's any older than that, then you just don't believe the Bible. Okay, now let's get to the important part. How much time we got? 7:05. Good grief. What does the Bible actually say? Because isn't that the most important question? Right? Okay, so I gave you all that history just so you could kind of see where certain things come from. And you always want to know what the earliest Christians believed. I mean, you just need to know that, all right? You can disagree with them, but you still need to know what they thought. So all that's good information, but with any debate on doctrine, we cannot rely completely on ancient or modern Christian writers. Got it? Who are writing outside the Bible or after the Bible is finished. We have to ask, what does the text of the Bible say, and what can the text support? So what does it say? And if you have some view that's not all that clear, can the text support your view, or does the text actually go against it? That's the question you need to ask. Now, the other thing we need to know is if the Bible leaves something open-ended or unclear. And by the way, the Bible does that multiple times. End times. Is that real clear? No. Messianic prophecies in the Old Testament were not clear until Jesus showed up and fulfilled them, and people went, "Oh, that was what Isaiah was talking about," right? Because the Old Testament, it's a side note here, the prophecies about the Messiah dying on a cross, when that was written, crucifixion didn't exist yet. So when they saw him crucified, they went, "Oh," right? So there are things in the Bible that aren't all that clear, and we have to be willing to admit that. There's some things you're not going to know, okay? You're not going to have completely figured out, right? Because his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. His ways are higher than our ways, okay? So you're not going to have everything figured out. And we need to be humble in our interpretations. That's how the early Christians were. They were humble about it. They didn't go around beating people up because you thought the days were literal and you didn't. Well, you're not a Christian because you don't believe what I believe. They weren't doing that, okay? Not on this issue, okay? So let's spend a few minutes talking about how to read Genesis responsibly, okay? We good? All still awake? The author of Genesis had never heard of science or geology and wrote nothing about the age of the earth. We just need to admit that. There's nothing in Genesis 1 that gives you a date. It's not there. The creation story says nothing about when, because the focus is on who and why. The creation story is about God as the creator, and he's bringing order out of chaos because it was without form and void, and he starts putting things in order. Okay? And, many people don't know this, the creation story and many stories in the early chapters of Genesis are a polemic against other creation stories in the ancient world. What I mean by polemic is it's taking shots at those other religions and their creation stories. When you look at the Babylonian creation story or the Ugaritic literature on this, or the Assyrians or any Canaanite creation stories, when you read theirs and then you read ours, you can see exactly what Moses is doing. He's shooting holes in all those things. So let me give you an example. Most of the creation stories of the ancient world, even those that were written down before Moses lived, all of them have the creation story. The creation comes out as a result of multiple gods fighting each other. That's how the creation got here. Okay? Almost all of them have that. This God is fighting with this God, and while they were fighting, something happened, and boom, here's the world. Okay? Sounds crazy, doesn't it? And people say the Bible is crazy. What our Bible's doing is taking shots at that and going, no, it wasn't a bunch of gods doing this. There was one God, and he created everything. Even the spirits you think are gods, he created them too. They're just rebels against him, right? That's what the Bible's doing. So we have to keep that in mind. We got to keep the ancient context in mind. So it's not about when. Actually, you've seen this before if you were with us a long time ago, but this is how you should be looking at the creation story. We look at it linearly, right? Because we have a page that goes from here to here. But remember, Hebrew authors write in shapes. They shape their narratives. And this is how the creation story is meant to be read, especially from the original. The first 3 days, he's making the spaces for life. So the heavens, the waters, the land. Day 4, 5, and 6 just happen to perfectly correspond with those. He's filling the heavens with lights. He fills the waters with sea creatures. He fills the land with animals and humans. So do you see what's going on there? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, they go together. All right? So that's how we're supposed to think about this. He's making the space. He's filling the space. And if you read Genesis chapter 1, Moses doesn't say on October 22nd, 4004 BC, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, your Schofield Bible, right at the top of the page, it'll say 4004 BC, right? And I read those when I was growing up, and I was thinking, wow, that's so cool. They know the dates of when all this stuff happened. And they don't. Anyway, so here's some things about Genesis that I want us to keep in mind. This is how to read it responsibly, okay? The first phrase in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, or Bereshit in Hebrew, which is a fun word to say in front of your kids. So they're like, you said what? Anyway, it just means what was first. There's no indication of time, no indication of when. It's just, this is the first thing that happened. Way back when, back in the day, this is what happened. When the biblical authors want to tell us a date, they usually say something like, and this is in Genesis, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, such and such happened. Or, in Jeremiah, and these are just two examples, there's multiple ones, in the 11th year of Zedekiah, in the 4th month, in the 9th day of the month, this happened. That's pretty specific, isn't it? So you would think if Moses wrote Genesis chapter 7, when he's telling us something about Noah, you would think if he wanted us to know when the creation started, he would have said, in October 22nd, 4004 BC, right? They didn't even think BC and AD back then. So that's more of a modern idea. So there's not a specific when in Genesis 1. We've got to admit that, okay? Now, there may or may not be a gap of time between Genesis 1, 1 and 2 and Genesis 1, 3, okay? The text doesn't say there is, and it doesn't say there isn't. It just does this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. There could be a gap in any of those. It doesn't say there is. It doesn't say there isn't. So we just need to be honest about that. Now, I think it's entirely possible that God created the heavens and the earth, and who knows how long he did that and how long it was without form and void. We have no idea, do we? Do we? No, you don't. I'll tell you, you don't. Right? And then verse 3, there's a progression of 6 periods of something. They're called days in the text, but we're going to look more at that in a second. So there could be a gap. There might not be a gap. We shouldn't be dogmatic about it either way because the text doesn't say, does it? No. Okay. Here's another thing about reading Genesis. The word day. Now, if you go look up young earth creationists, they will tell you that day, yom in Hebrew, means 24 hours all the time. All the time. That's what it means. And you have to believe that's what it means or you don't believe the Bible. I heard a guy say that today. Okay? Not all of them say that, but a lot of them do. Here's a problem with that. In Genesis chapter 1 into chapter 2, it's used for different durations of time in the text. And you don't need to know Hebrew. You can see it in English. Right? Like in verse 5 and verse 14, day just refers to the daylight hours. Well, that's not 24 hours, is it? No, it's the daylight hours. But it's called day, right? I mean, I'll prove it to you. God said, let there be light. He saw that the light was good. He separated the light from the darkness, and he called the light day. That's the daylight hours. And he called the darkness night. That's the nighttime hours, right? And there was evening and morning the first day. So right there, in verse 5, it's used 2 different ways in the same verse. Daylight hours, and then there's some evening and morning thing with a day, even though there's no sun yet, right? So, also, it talks about time with a beginning and an end, an evening and a morning. So there's some kind of beginning and end kind of thing. That's in each of the days. And then in the 7th day, there's no beginning or no end. There's no evening and morning. The 7th day is like, well, when did that end? read Hebrews. He's got an interesting interpretation in Hebrews. He talks about the rest of God. We have entered the seventh-day rest of God. Interesting. So they're clearly not reading that story exactly how everybody today is. Then this is interesting. In Genesis 2:4, it says the whole creation, the whole thing happened in one day. Because it says, in the day, the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. So if day always means 24 hours, then why does your Bible use it different ways in that chapter? Just an interesting observation. Not telling you what to think. I'm just telling you how to think. Okay? Here's another one. If our understanding of a literal 24-hour day is determined by the sun, right? How do you determine that a whole day has passed? The sun went up and it went down and then it came up right over there again 24 hours later. That's a day, right? Okay. How could the first 3 days in the creation story be literal 24-hour days when there's no sun yet? Sun's not created till the fourth day. Now, I've heard some people say, well, he created light on the first day. That was the sun. Here's the problem with that. Did I put it on here? Yeah, we'll just read it. And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. So whatever these lights are he's about to make, separate the day from the night. It's something to do with time. And let them be for signs and for seasons, that's time, and for days and years. So this is time beginning as we know it. Okay? And let them be lights in the expanse of the heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made the two great lights. That's the sun and the moon. Now, it doesn't use sun and moon because those were the names of gods that other countries worshipped at the time. Like Egypt worshiped the sun god Ra, right? So they don't call it sun and moon because that's like we don't name those gods because we don't worship them. He just calls it the great lights, literally lamps, the great lamps. There's the big lamp and the little lamp, the sun and the moon, okay? He made them on day 4. Right there it says it. So the light in day 1 is not the sun. And by the way, the sun's not the only light out there, is it? No, there's all kinds of... The center, we've got stars. And then you ever seen a picture of the Milky Way? Guess what's in the middle of that thing? A whole bunch of light, right? So he creates light on day 1. Day 4, he creates the sun. So if we're saying they're 24-hour days, how does that work in the first 3 days? Do you see how if you really think this through, it's not as clear as you might have thought, right? What else did I put here? Okay, already covered that. One more. I think it's one more. No, there's one more after this. It's going to be even worse, but here we go. The phrase in Genesis 2:4, these are the generations. So if you have your Bible, Genesis 2:4, it says, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth in the day that the Lord made the heavens and the earth, right? These are the generations. The Hebrew word is toledot. It's always used in Genesis to introduce what happens next, not to retell a former story. In Genesis, okay, so the rule in Genesis, every time in Genesis, when it says these are the generations, it's introducing something next, not going back and retelling something else. Now, I always thought that day 6 of creation, when he creates humans, male and female, I thought Genesis chapter 2, the garden story, was just retelling day 6. That's how I always thought about it. And then I learned to read it in the original language, and I started looking at how Genesis uses these generations terminology, and I noticed that every time that phrase is used, it's never going back and telling something former. It's always pointing to a new part. So that's interesting. And I put all the references there for you. Those are in the notes. And a toledot, these are the generations, are always describing an order of events moving forward, not backwards. So usually it's seen in a genealogy, right? Those things you read in your morning devotions, the genealogies. Nobody reads those. If you know how to read them, they're interesting though. So they always are pointing forward to the next part of the story, not going backwards and retelling something. So that's an interesting feature going on there. And that leads to this. Now, I just want to tell you before I get into this, you've heard me talk about this before way back a long time ago when we first started doing Wednesday night. I'm not dogmatic about this. I'm just saying there's some interesting things in the text here when you compare the two chapters. That's all I'm saying. Okay? We good? Keep your rocks in your pocket. All right? The order of events in the creation account, that's chapter 1 all the way to 2-3, because our chapter divisions were made up later, right? So 1-1 to 2-3 is the 7 days of creation. The order of events there does not match the order of events in chapter 2. That's an interesting thing to point out. So in chapter 1, you've got plants are created, then animals, and then humans, both male and female. In chapter 2, though, the chapter starts with there's no plants. And then a male human is created, Adam, Hebrew. Then God plants a garden. Then animals, then the female. Those two orders don't match. Now, atheists, people trying to disprove the Bible, point that out. And they say, see, it contradicts each other. But that's not how you should read it. Because if these are the generations, it's pointing forward to a new part of the story, then it's telling us, and I realize it's controversial, that chapter 2, the Eden story, came after the 6 days of creation. Now I want to go ahead and acknowledge, that leads to a lot more questions than answers. Okay? I'm just telling you, my job is to say, look at this and think about it. All right? This could, though, help us explain why in Genesis chapter 4, there's all these people outside the garden. Those could be the people, male and female, created in chapter 1. That's a theory. Please understand I'm telling you that that's a theory. But it does help to explain why Cain is scared to death that somebody out there is going to kill him. Nobody else is alive yet. If Adam and Eve were created in day 6, nobody else is alive yet. It's Adam and Eve and Cain. And there would be Abel, but Cain murdered him, right? And he tells him, I want you to go wander. You're going to have to go further away from Eden. So there's the garden, there's Eden. His parents were put out in the region of Eden. And then Cain is pushed further out. And he says, well, this is going to be too much for me. Somebody out there is going to kill me. And God doesn't say, hey, dummy, nobody else is out there. God says, no, I'll protect you. I'm going to put a sign on you and nobody's going to hurt you, or I'll take vengeance on them. So God acknowledges in the story there's people out there. And then what's the first thing Cain does? He gets married. Now, if you go with the young earth creationists, they said, well, that was Cain's sister. Only problem is Cain doesn't have any sisters until chapter 5. And that's the next part of the story. These are the generations of Adam, and it tells the story, right? So it kind of does help. Now, it leads to a lot of other questions, okay? And some of the old earth creationists, they say that when we dig up stuff that looks very human, but looks a little different, that could be the Genesis 1 people we're digging up. So I understand that sounds crazy. I'm just telling you, when you look at the text, it seems to be more complex than people like you to think. Okay? That's all I'm saying. All right? So I'm not telling you have to believe any of that. I'm just saying, look at that. Think about it. Okay? All right. Here's a conclusion. I can't believe I'm ending before 7:30. Y'all better be proud. 4,000 words. That many times. Anyway, here's the conclusion. Whichever view we take on creation, whichever view you take. Now remember, you have to believe, if you're going to be a Christian, that God did it. Okay, you can't compromise that one. All right? But whatever view beyond that you take, we must remain humble and willing to learn and willing to adjust our view accordingly. When we're presented with truth, we have to be willing to adjust to it. Okay? If it's truth, right? Now, I want to be very clear. It's often said that old earth creationists are only old earth because they're trying to make sense out of evolution. That's often said. And some of them may be doing that, but that is not true for the majority of people who believe the earth is old. Okay? There's a great guy, you can look him up on YouTube. Good luck understanding everything he says, but his name is Stephen Meyer, and he's a scientist, and he's a Christian, and he's an old earth creationist, and he does not believe in evolution. He actually writes entire books showing that evolution is not scientifically possible. And he shows you that by using DNA and computational biology and all this stuff that's hard to understand. So if you listen to him, he makes a very good argument. He has a book called Darwin's Doubt. And he points out that even Darwin said there are huge gaps with no transitional life forms. Like there's fish and then there's land animals. And there's nothing like that's half fish, half land animal anywhere. But Darwin believed that as we continued to dig up different places, we would find those. And what Stephen Meyer argues, he's an old earth guy, but he's not an evolutionist. He argues the more time has gone on since Darwin, the more we've dug up, the bigger the gap has gotten. It went the opposite way than what Darwin thought. And then he's got a lot of good stuff in there. But you can watch him on YouTube. He's really good. Another old Earth guy is Hugh Ross. He is a astrophysicist, and he is a very godly man. And he's an old Earth guy. He's an old universe guy. But he makes some very good arguments about his viewpoint. So whatever view we take, just realize there are really godly people that love Jesus just as much or more than you on both sides of this issue. Okay? So if I think all the days were 6 days and they were completely literal and they were all 24 hours and the earth is only 6,000 years old. God bless you. That's fine. That's cool. We can still fellowship together. We can be part of the same church. If you're a person that says, well, I think the earth probably might be 4.6 billion years old, and I think the universe might be, 14 point something billion years old. I think that might be true because of astronomy, do the math. Well, good. That's no problem for me either. But if you were to say, I'm not so sure God really did this, now we got a discussion to have. Because now you've walked outside the text of the Bible and started coming up with your own idea. Okay? So, the purpose of all this was just to say, here's the information. You can decide which view you want, but we're not going to divide over this issue in our church. Thank you. I got nervous there for a minute. We're not going to be divided. We're not going to call somebody an idiot because they differ in our view. We're not going to say that person must not believe the Bible or they must not really be a Christian or maybe they don't have enough of the Holy Spirit. We're not going there. And the early Christians didn't go there either. The early Christians acknowledged, like Theophilus of Antioch, hey, this thing's bigger than we can understand and we should act accordingly. Nobody was confused about who did it. And honestly, the early Christians didn't care when he did it. You know why they didn't care? Because Rome was hunting them down and killing them and burning them for lamps for the emperor's party. They didn't have time to argue about were the 6 days 24-hour days or 6,000 years or was it, how did all that work? Nobody was concerned about that. It was Jesus is king, not the emperor. Follow Jesus. And imagine this invitation. Come follow Jesus. You'll probably get killed. And a bunch of people signed up. Thousands upon thousands signed up. Because of their sacrifice, we're still here. Amen? So we don't need to argue about this, do we? All right. So next week, I don't know exactly. I've got a few topics, but we're going to cover each one of these topics are going to be really good. So next week, we're going to move on to the next thing. And I may have you another printout. We'll see if I can pull that off in time. And we'll move on to the next thing next time.